Hey everyone. Today I want to have a short video to give you an idea of some characteristics of a strong thesis in an argument-driven literature paper, and to talk about the hierarchy of what I would consider going from a weak thesis, why a thesis might be considered weak, to a strong thesis, and give you some examples of some of the common characteristics of each of these categories, and how, at least in my class, each of these would slot into typical C, B, and A grade categories. I'm also going to follow up in this video by talking a little bit about some common danger signals in any literature paper. So again, that may sound like a lot, but I'm hoping that we can work through these in a pretty efficient manner. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the characteristics of a thesis in an argument-driven literature paper. So the very first thing that you need to keep in mind is the enthymeme structure that we talked about in an earlier video. That is the structure of claim. And why should I or any reasonable person believe this, which is basically the argumentative structure at the heart of most, if not all, academic writing. And this is indeed the structure of the paper. The thesis is the claim. The rest of your paper is where you essentially work to earn that claim through the use of evidence and analysis of that evidence. So your claim is your thesis. The rest of your paper is evidence and support for that thesis. With that in mind, your thesis is the most important sentence in your paper. It is the place where you both say what the main point of your paper is, and it's where you signal to your reader that you know what that claim is. Okay, so a few things to know about your thesis. It should be a claim, not an observation about the text. So it should be an argument. It should be clear. It should be specific. It should not leave your reader in any doubt about what your argument is. I've sometimes had students say, oh, I leave it towards the end of the text so that, so that I'm not kind of giving everything away. I'd like to emphasize that an argument-driven paper is not a mystery novel. So you don't actually want to leave your readers guessing. It's not a suspense driven genre in any way. So you want it to be clear, specific, and it should be at the beginning of your paper. But what I mean by that is it should be located at the end of the introductory paragraph of your paper. Okay. A couple of other characteristics of your thesis in a literature paper is that it should be about the text. What I mean about that is the genre of literary analysis or literary criticism is what we call a conceptual argument. So you can have a conceptual argument, you can have a pragmatic argument. A conceptual argument basically says, how do we understand X better? A pragmatic argument says, what should we do about X? Or, how do we solve X? So a literature paper, right, is asking essentially, how do we understand the text better? So for that reason, your thesis really should be based in terms of the text. So you might say something like King Lear, meaning the play, suggests Y or X, right? You typically will focus a thesis around a stronger understanding of the logic or the meaning that the text argues or suggests through the evidence it presents, through the course of the text, right? So you want to kind of focus your argument on the text. That is your focus. That is your object of study. You do not want it focused on, let's say, humanity. So you're not using the text to prove something about humanity or history or culture or reality, right? What you are doing is you are drawing evidence from the text to make an argument about the text. Okay. Another thing about your thesis is you want to make sure that your thesis matches your argument, right? I mean, this makes a little bit of sense when you're talking about an enthymeme claim. Why should I believe that claim? Okay, you want to make sure that those two things match. And the only reason I bring this up is many of us, when we are writing, we will sometimes start with a thesis or an exploratory thesis, but in the process of writing, sometimes our writing might actually take us to a different place than we anticipated. If that's the case, one of the last things you may find yourself doing when you revise your paper is to go back and look at your thesis and make sure that the thesis you anticipated before you wrote your paper actually matches the paper you wrote and not the paper you thought you were going to write. So make sure that there's a one-to-one relationship between your thesis and your final argument in your paper. So these are some things that you kind of want to keep in mind with your thesis. You want it to be clear, you want it to be specific, you want it to be focused on the text, you want it at the end of your introduction, and you want to make sure that it matches the argument that your paper lands on in the end. I've often found in my own writing that I will actually start with what I call a placeholder thesis, which means I know from the way that I write, I will usually have some real movement in or change from the original place where I think my argument is going to be. In the course of writing my paper, there will be some alteration or often some deeper specificity once I've gotten into the nitty-gritty of making my argument. So I know that that thesis is probably going to change by the time I've gotten to the end of my paper. So in acknowledgement of that, what I will typically do in my first draft, I feel more comfortable when I have at least a beginning thesis as a kind of guide. What I will usually do is I will put that there and I will bold it so that I have a kind of visual cue to go back and to revise it by the time I get to the end of the paper, to go back, make it more specific and make it more compatible with my end result. That may work for you, it may not. Your writing process may be different than mine, but it's a good habit to get into if you, like me, tend to be a sort of exploratory writer. Okay, so let's talk about thesis statements. There's a kind of hierarchy of thesis statements, and I would say some of the characteristics that go into that hierarchy have to do with the quality of the claim. One, is it a claim? Is it a specific claim? Is it a claim about the text? And do you, the writer, clearly articulate what I would call the significance or the so what of your claim? Okay, and this is going to become a little bit more clear, I would say, with some examples of real life thesis statements. So what I wanted to do is I thought I would give you some examples of different potential thesis statements focusing on Shakespeare's play King Lear, some of which start out at kind of the lower level of papers that maybe might pass, assuming all things being equal. The rest of the paper gives good textual evidence, analyzes that evidence. It's put together into coherent introduction, body paragraphs, conclusion. They're giving, and they're giving that textual evidence, citing it, all of those things, assuming that all of those structural elements are all intact, and this thesis is accurate to it. We'll start with somewhat weaker thesis statements and then talk about why I would consider them weaker thesis statements, and then we'll build up to some of the stronger ones. So let's look at what some of these might look like. Okay, so let's start at the C range. Okay, so some examples of a C thesis might look something like this. This is sort of, this top one is a sort of classic C range thesis statement. The early modern period was sexist and discriminated against women. In King Lear, women, especially women in power, are represented as evil and treated terribly because of this. Okay, so if you look at this, this is a type of thesis I see often, especially in papers dealing with prior time periods. It's very easy for us to make generalizations about the past, especially if it's a time period we aren't terribly familiar with. The closer it gets to the present, the more we identify with the time period. Generally, the less likely we are to make these kinds of generalizations. But in this case, what we have here is a paper that might effectively show a pattern of in-text evidence for particular forms of bias against women. But King Lear or any other single text really can't stand in for an entire culture or time period. So to kind of give another example, you couldn't use the Da Vinci Code, for example, to talk about the early 20th century and say, see, this proves everything we need to know about the early, 21st century. Same thing with something like Twilight. You know, you can say, well, now that we read Twilight, you could imagine someone 50 or 100 years from now saying, well, having read Twilight, now we know everything we need to know about that century. Most of us would probably be pretty uncomfortable with that mindset because we instinctively know that everything our communities, our culture, everything those things are, everything we are, can't be encapsulated into one cultural artifact. And the same thing is true of any other time period. So what we can kind of see has happened in this particular case is someone has effectively tried to do that. So the writer starts with a historical generalization, and what they're doing here is they're looking to King Lear as an example of that generalization. Okay. Other versions of this that we can see sometimes is people will sometimes make generalizations about humanity, about institutions, about, and when I'm saying something like institutions, they might say something like families do this, parents want this, right? So they'll start with a generalization and then they'll look to a particular text in order to kind of say, see, and here's an example of that. And what happens when you do that is you aren't actually analyzing the text, right? You're using the text as an example of an opinion or a generalization that actually has nothing to do with the text. So your argument isn't about the text. You are using the text as evidence for something that actually could be a claim you made without reference to the text at all. So you want to avoid that. You want your thesis to actually be driven by the text and driven by internal evidence from the text. Okay, so keep that in mind. Another kind of common C pattern might be an overly vague or general pattern that's identified in the text with no significance to the pattern identified or articulated. So an example of this might be something like families in King Lear are dysfunctional. I could see this paper, you'd basically say, yep, families are dysfunctional in the thesis. Paragraph 1 would be Gloucester's family is dysfunctional. Let me count the ways. Body paragraph 2 might be something like, Lear's family is dysfunctional in all of these ways. And then maybe body paragraph 3 might be something like marriages in King Lear are very dysfunctional. Body paragraph 4 might be brothers and sisters, you're right, sibling relationships, very dysfunctional. So, it's just very, you would basically have a 5-paragraph essay structure, but there's no significance in the thesis. You don't tell us why that matters. You don't tell us how they're dysfunctional. You don't tell us why they're dysfunctional, what it means that they're dysfunctional, what the text is arguing in terms of why it's important or what the consequences of that dysfunction might be, right? All of those ways that you could specify further, think about the causes and the effects according to the text of that, right? None of that is there. It's just a very kind of generalized, I recognize a very vague pattern. Let me now describe that pattern to you. That is likely to get us a very kind of vaguely descriptive, but not very explanatory, not very analytical paper. And that's what kind of brings it to the C range. On a kind of similar note, you might have something like this. The fool is the only character in King Lear who consistently tells the truth. This type of thesis I think of as a character-based thesis. It's a sort of assertion about a character that isn't attached to any larger argument. And it might have a kind of, often it tends to have a little bit of blinders on it, which is what I mean by shaky textual basis. So for example, a reader who's kind of paying attention might have some questions about, well, wait a minute, what about Cordelia? Cordelia consistently tells the truth. Kent actually sort of famously consistently tells the truth, as long as we overlook the fact that he's in disguise for most of the play. So right, again, much like the previous thesis, we also have the problem of the significance of this, like, why does it matter that the fool is the only character, if we even took that on its face value, that he's the only one telling the truth? That would, you know, we would need to know that. Why is that important? You know, as is, this almost seems more like an observation, and it goes no further in its significance than an observation about a character. We don't know why it matters. We don't know how it ties into larger issues or themes in the text. We haven't learned anything bigger about the text, King Lear, by making that assertion. Okay, so just as a kind of recap, your C-level papers tend to be marked by generalizations. They tend to be marked by vagueness, and they don't show a larger significance to the text of what you're observing or describing. Now you notice I'm not really talking about papers that don't make it to the C level. To make it to a C level, you need to have a thesis in your paper. Ideally, it's at the end of your introductory paragraph, and that thesis at least needs to make some sort of gesture towards being a claim, you know, driven by or about the text. Occasionally, I will get some thesis statements that are sort of like, I related to X character. I would really advise you against, like sometimes that can work in if you have a class that has a personal reflection type assignment, but those will usually be very short reflective papers or journaling or in class discussion, very appropriate for class discussion, probably not for a long form and definitely not for a thesis driven paper, because generally something like I related to, let's say I really related to Edmund, or I really relate to Killmonger, if you decide to write about Black Panther, in the end, that doesn't tell us anything about the text, but it does tell us a lot about you. But the assignment is asking you to analyze the text. So try to avoid that type of personal reflection, because it doesn't actually get us closer to understanding the text. Okay. Any type of argument that takes us outside of the text is going to move you further and further away from those passing grades, because it's actually taking you away from textual evidence and the assignment proper, which is asking you to make an analytical argument driven by internal evidence from the text. So an argument about the text that is supported by evidence within the text. Okay. All right. So let's move up a little bit to a B level thesis. So largely what makes a B level thesis a little bit different is going to be specificity of the observation or the pattern that is observed. I often call this the pretty pattern paper. Typically, B thesis papers tend towards making an observation or noting a pattern in the text with a great deal more specificity and clarity than the C-level paper. So these tend to be statements that are very astute in observing an important thread in the text, describing it clearly, but they tend not to move into what I think of as the second important stage of a thesis, which is saying why it matters according to the text. So for example, King Lear consistently represents the patriarchal figures of Lear and Gloucester as problematic and abusive fathers, and lords who constantly threaten the survival of the next generation of their families and politics. So what we see here is it's a specific observation. It points out a specific and important pattern in the text, but it doesn't follow up with that significance. It doesn't tell us why the pattern matters within the logic that's set up throughout the text. It doesn't tell us why the play thinks we should care about that pattern or what the consequences of this particular pattern are according to the text. So what you can think of is that the B-level thesis is typically specific and it points out important patterns, but so an interesting or a compelling pattern within the text, but it doesn't go on to what I call the so what stage. In other words, why should we care about this according to the text? Why does it matter according to the text? What argument does this pattern suggest as it plays out in the text? Okay, so can you have a B thesis that isn't a pretty pattern? Possibly, but usually that's an A-type thesis that is maybe improperly executed. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's move on to the A thesis and we can talk about that. Okay, an A thesis is where you have one of those complicated, pretty patterns and you talk about why that pattern matters. So an example of that would be something like this. And you'll notice that this actually very closely mirrors the last thesis, but it's a little bit more specific, right? And it tells us why that pattern matters. So in King Lear, lordly fathers often catastrophically misrecognize and mistreat their children, leading to disaster for their families, themselves, and ultimately their lands. The play suggests that the basis of political authority on familial bonds and bloodlines leads to abuse, chaos, and ultimately destruction because of the inherent lack of mutuality and reciprocity embedded within the patriarchal family. Now, there's a lot going on in here, right? No doubt. And you could break this up a little bit more to kind of make clear the lines. It's a fallacy that a thesis needs to be only one sentence. In fact, as you can see here, you could say that obviously there's two sentences here. It's broken up into a couple of different roles, which we'll talk about in a minute. But what I want to point out here is that the thesis here is not only identifying an important pattern in the text, but it is also explaining the significance of that claim. So again, we can think of this sort of like an enthymeme. The significance is the claim, and that claim is justified and supported by presenting the overall textual pattern that occurs in the text that you are making an argument about. Okay, so you here are identifying the specific textual pattern, and then here you are making the claim. Okay, and that's your significance. Okay, so you can think of the claim, you want to think of that claim as a product of the logic that the text has built over the course of those patterns. And I just want to make that distinction because you don't want to be talking about the text as, let's say, reflecting reality. You want to be talking about the logic that it is itself building through representation, right? So the patterns that it builds through, you know, through the text, because it is, those are choices, right? It is a construction. The text itself is constructed. Yeah, so we'll leave it at that. Just to kind of bring home the idea of the enthymeme, I just kind of want to show the construction of that thesis. So let's just look at that one more time with the two parts highlighted. The yellow part is the pattern of evidence, okay? The blue part, or the cyan part, right, is the claim which states the significance of the pattern, right? So again, if we think of this as an enthymeme, it's a little bit inverted. So we say claim, why should I or any reasonable person believe that claim, right? So it's an inverted enthymeme. This is the claim, and this is the evidence. So the play suggests that the basis of political authority on familial models and bloodlines leads to abuse, chaos, and ultimately destruction because of the inherent lack of mutuality and reciprocity embedded within the patriarchal family. Why should I believe that? Well, I should believe that because in King Lear, lordly fathers often catastrophically misrecognize and mistreat their children, leading to disaster for their families, themselves, and ultimately their lands. The job of your paper is then going to be to chart out that pattern, to show that pattern, and then also to show how the text draws a relationship between that pattern of parental blindness and parental abuse and this larger societal collapse, right? Like that would be your job in the paper, is going to be to make clear those lines of connections and the ways that the text builds those lines of connection and inference. Okay, so that would be the work of the body of your paper, to build that step by step with quotes and then analysis of the quotes showing how those associations are being drawn. Okay, so I hope that makes sense in terms of that sort of hierarchy of argument. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the, what I call the danger signs of when you might see that the argumentation in your paper might be going a little bit awry. So I just kind of want to give you a short list of what I would call the red flags, maybe orange to red flags, depending on which item we're talking about. So let's look at these guys here. Okay, so the first example of a sort of red flag in your paper, right, is going to be, is the topic of your paper a character? I would actually call this probably an orange flag. If the subject of your thesis is a character, the danger here is that you are basically going to do a character study, but not an analysis. An example of this is very frequently people will either talk about how they feel about a character, whether or not they think a character is a good character or a bad character, which isn't really a textual analysis, right? It'll often be based on their a moralization, which is again going to tell us more about the sort of moral beliefs of the writer than it is going to tell us about the logic constructed by a text, right? So it's a very different thing to argue in a thesis, King Lear is a bad king, than it is to say the play argues that King Lear is a bad king because, right? Like those are two, and then fill in the blank as to why, according to the play, King Lear is a bad king. To just say King Lear is a bad king tells us that the person writing that paper has a personal idea of what a good king should be that is probably ahistorical and isn't grounded in the text, and they're about to tell us why they personally think King Lear doesn't live up to their standards of what a good leader or what a good king is. To make the argument that the play suggests that Lear is a bad king, you notice that just by foregrounding the play as the subject of the thesis, really draws our attention to not necessarily King Lear, but King Lear's failure because of the play's own construction of what kingship should be, or the play's own construction of, whatever is at the end of that because clause. Right. And that's a really important distinction because it draws the argument back into the text as opposed to the sort of arbitrary and subjective opinion of the person writing the paper. You always want your argument to be driven by internal evidence and the internal logic of the text you're reading, as opposed to the personal opinions of the writer. Okay, so number one, is the topic, or I would say even the subject of your thesis, a character, you may be in trouble. It's not the kiss of death, but I would say it's an orange flag. Okay, if the subject of your thesis is a time period, a community, a culture, or humanity itself, you in danger. Okay, so that would be an extreme red flag, because instead of doing a textual analysis, what that suggests is much like the in best case scenario, possibly a C paper. What's happening here is you are not actually arguing about the text. You are using the text as an example to make an argument about something else. And that argument is likely to be an unsupported opinion, moralization, or generalization. Okay. And so in other words, it's something you could have made an argument about without ever having read the text in question. Right. So you don't want that. Okay. So I would consider number 2 a red flag. Okay. Number 3 is also, I would say, an orange to a red flag are the transitions in your paper, plot transitions, disconnected from your argument, claims, terms, or analysis. Okay, what do I mean by that? If you start all of your body paragraphs with topic sentences that are plot summary, and kind of tell us the next thing that happens in the plot, or just if you just start your body paragraphs with plot description, you are probably in trouble, because what that likely means, right, is that you are probably not looking beyond the plot of the text into the ways that the text is representing, that it's supporting different ideologies, discourses, or values, the ways that it uses symbols. You're very likely not analyzing the text at a deeper level, okay? It also suggests it's very hard once you start describing and then this happens and then this happens, it's very likely that you're going to have it's very hard to stop telling the story as opposed to analyzing the evidence, right? And so you may get into a problem of excessive plot summary. Generally, I would argue that after 2 sentences of explaining what happened in a text, you're wandering into excessive plot summary. Right? So you want to use direct evidence as much as possible. You want to imagine a reader who is familiar with the text. You want to imagine that person as maybe someone who is familiar with the text, but maybe hasn't read or watched the text in about 6 months. So they do need a reminder of exact moments or the exact words, right? So that they don't have it memorized. But you should not be giving full plot summaries at any point. So I would say, as rule of thumb, if you find yourself re-narrating a text for longer than 2 sentences, it's probably time to check yourself. A good sign that you might be doing this is check your transitions, check your first sentences of body paragraphs and make sure that they're not plot oriented. They should be claim oriented. That's how you want to organize your paper. If you haven't watched my video on body paragraph construction for the literature paper, I strongly recommend you do so. But number one, your transitions and your really your topic sentences should be claim based. They should not be based in plot summary. Okay, the last one, kind of related, is your paper organized chronologically? Okay, what this is a red flag for, if all of your paragraphs are organized in the kind of chronological order of your text, unless you're looking at something like a sonnet, like a very short form text with a very sort of rigid order of logic. And even then it might be a little bit of an issue. But generally, if your paper is organized in chronological order, what it might suggest is that, again, you're going a little bit more descriptive rather than analytical in terms of organizing your argument by claims and ideas, rather than just following the text and describing what you see. Okay, so if you find yourself falling into that particular pattern, you might want to stop and recheck your topic sentences and make sure that those topic sentences are focusing on concepts, ideas, things like institutions and concepts, rather than plot descriptions. Okay, so these are just a few things to kind of keep in mind when you're thinking about what I would call your signposting statements. Those would be the places where the claims are located in your papers. So basically your thesis and your topic sentences. I hope that's helpful. Good luck on your papers, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.